Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to this lecture. With the title of this lecture, as you can see, is Pre-20th Translation Theory. In this lecture, we shall be discussing three main things. Number one, what do we mean by translation theory in this context, especially the historical era that we are going to cover. Number two, dominant trends. What were the dominant or prevalent ideas and trends that have been there during this era? And last is the concluding remarks. Meaning of the translation theory. We mean by the word translation theory here the ideas and the concepts presented by some philosophers, translators, thinkers, and scholars uh, in Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Chinese civilization as far the translation product or process is concerned. We have very important comment on that we see that there is no detailed systematic thinking found among these philosophers or thinkers regarding translation or translation theory. Of course, there were ideas, there were opinions, and they were very nice. Some of them were very good opinions, but not systematic thinking. By translation, of course, the ideas that we shall discuss, they are related to source text, that is the original language, or target text, that is the language to which a translation is done, or text type. There are different text types, and then the ideas about the word or the meaning, sense, or truth, style, faithfulness, and so on, so forth. We shall be discussing the philosophers' opinion of the philosophers in the Western world, and we know that the focus has been on Bible or other religious translations or some philosophical texts. As far the Arabs are concerned, their text was the Greek books on philosophy and related sciences. Chinese, when we discuss the translation theory among the Chinese civilization, the most prominent activity is found in the Buddhist translation of Buddhist sutras from Sanskrit to Chinese language. And some scholars, they have called this period a pre-linguistic period of translation theory. The dominant trends that we are going to touch, or we are going to actually discuss some of them in detail, are five in number. Number one is word for word and sense for sense, or literal versus free translation. Number two, Bible translation and heresy. Number three, discussion on faithfulness, spirit, and truth. Number four, early attempts for systematic theory. And then translation theory in Britain. As for the trends are concerned, this is our classification for this lecture. So let's start with the word for word or sense for sense translation, or literal versus free translation. What is meant by word for word translation? It is simply, as you can see here, is the replacement of each individual word of the source language, that is the original language, with its closest grammatical equivalent in the target text or the target language. This is the basic concept of the word for word translation or literal translation that have been prevalent in the history. Although nowadays, when we discuss this phenomenon, word for word translation, it has now some improved forms, and some other aspects are also included in word for word translation. No need to drift to those aspects right now in this lecture, although we shall be discussing them in future lectures. Sense for sense means focusing on the transfer of the meaning. So the main keyword here is meaning of source text into target text. Usually with this concept, the structure of the source language or the style of the source language is usually ignored. When the philosophers or thinkers or translators then they discuss this concept, they usually ignore and they focus on the meaning or the content of the source text. We find one of the famous Latin philosopher and translation of many Attic orators, Cicero, and when he is he has translated I think two orators of Attic, very famous orators. There were 10 Attic orators in the Greek language, so he has translated two of them into Latin language. So introducing his own translation of the speeches of these two orators, he says, "And I did not translate them as an interpreter, but as an orator, keeping the same ideas and forms, or as one might say, the figures of thought, but in language which conforms to our age. And in so doing, I did not hold it necessary to render word for word, but I preserved the general style and force of the language." This quote of Cicero is almost clear, only the word interpreter, because here the interpreter stands for the translator who translates word for word. But see, the meaning of the Cicero in this through this paragraph is that I put myself in the shoes of that orator, and then I try to transfer the ideas, keeping the same ideas and forms, although he's trying the form as well in his mind, but the main is figures of thought, and trying to, of course, keep the general style and force of the language intact. Saint Jerome is another philosopher and theologian, and the one who translated Bible into Latin. He revised and corrected earlier Latin translations of New Testament. For the Old Testament, he returned to the Hebrew, which created controversy. We are not going to discuss that controversy, but his contribution or his prominence in the area of translation is this, that he, number one, revised the earlier translations and actually edited them and refined them, updated them into Latin language. And also he translated Old Testament, and of course he translated them from Hebrew because he knew the Hebrew language. Saint Jerome views are very important and very crucial as for the pre-20th century translation theory is concerned. He based his views or his strategies for translation on what Cicero had written before him. He rejected, as Cicero rejected, the word for word approach, and it was his opinion that the word for word approach produced absurd translation and cloaking the sense of the original. It actually hides the sense of the original text. And in explaining this, Saint Jerome uses the military, the image of the original text, which is being marched into the target language like a prisoner by its conqueror, if it is translated by word for word. However, he stresses the special mystery of both the meaning and syntax of the Bible. His views about the translation, although he rejected word for word translation and he has preferred, like Cicero, the sense for sense translation, but he also analyzes his approach and explains in this way that the religious text, which is the Bible for him, has some significance, or there's a mystery embedded in that religious text. So the meanings and syntax of the Bible are a little bit a different topic that should be discussed or treated differently when they are translated into another language. So as for St. Jerome's strategy of translation is concerned, he says, "Now I not only admit, but freely announce that in translating from the Greek, except of course in the case of the Holy Scripture, as I said earlier, where even the syntax contains a mystery, I render not word for word, but sense for sense." Keep this very core idea of word for word and sense for sense in your mind, because we will see that that idea is always present in the writings of the subsequent philosophers, linguists, translators, theologians, and nowadays translation scholars. And keep also another aspect in your mind, that the St. Jerome's clarity about the word for word and applicability of the sense for sense translation is related to text types. Some text types, as we can deduct from his this paragraph, that he thinks that the sense for sense is best strategy for translating non-religious text. So this also will be very much related. We will relate this idea to what we are going to do when we come to the Quran translation. China. Chinese translation of Buddhist sutras from Sanskrit, as I indicated earlier, and of course they have also two basic concepts. The concept of uh, my pronunciation is Yiji, which means sense for sense, versus Jivi, which means straightforward or direct or word for word translation. So we see that the almost same two ideas are also here in the ancient Chinese translation activity, when the text, Sanskrit texts of the Buddhist religious texts were to be translated into Chinese language. The problem here is the translation or transliteration of foreign elements, where there are no equivalent or no words available in the target language, and also the names into non-phonetic language. When we say the non-phonetic language, we mean the written letters are pronounced in a different way. Of course, here in English, there are letters that are written but they are not pronounced. But as for the Chinese language is concerned, we should be aware that when we say Chinese language, we are not talking about the Mandarin. The Mandarin is the modern Chinese language, which is used, of course, nowadays in present China. But here, of course, we are talking about the old classic Chinese language, where there were no letters for writing, there were rather pictures. It was a pictorial language where the writing was, for the writing purpose, pictures were used. Translation choices are expounded in the prefaces to these texts. When all these sutras were translated, we find that the strategies or preferences for translating these texts are found in the prefaces of these texts. What was the dilemma whether to make a free? Again, is it same? Let me go back. Is it GE or it is GV approach? So whether to make a free, polished and shortened version, this was adapted to the taste of the Chinese public, or a faithful, literal, repetitious, thus unreadable translation. The same dilemma we see here. And even nowadays, even this in this 21st century, and the translation studies as an academic discipline has also advanced tremendously and very fastly as well. This dilemma is faced by almost all the translators, especially in the area of literature and religious texts. And of course, we are talking about the religious texts here again. So the dilemma can be described into two, three elements. One is to translate free, polished, and shortened version, which gives the meaning, which is adapted to the taste of the Chinese public. They understand this translation easily and quickly. Or the translator should be faithful to the original language, and of course, resultantly, would be translating word for word, and all the repetitions would be translated time and again, and the result would be that the translation would be like unreadable, it would be unclear for the readers. One of the famous translator or the religious leader is Duan, and who lived in this area. He regulated the strategy in 5 elements where deviation was acceptable. Of course, now we are going to come across with his ideas of translation. He says that the flexibility of Sanskrit syntax, wherever the flexibility of the Sanskrit, the original language syntax is there, you can deviate. Enhancement of literariness of the source text. The literariness of the source text should be enhanced in the translation. Omission of the repetition in argumentation. The translator is allowed to do that. Omission of the repetition in introductions. If things are repeated, the translator is allowed to summarize them or omit them. Omission of repetition of the summaries, different parts of these sutras. So he's suggesting that these 5 rules are, these 5 are the permissions for the translators where they can deviate from the source text. When we come to the Arabs, we have, and we should know, and I think we know that there was in Baghdad during Abbasid era, they established Harun Rashid and his son Mamun Rashid. They are the stars of this initiative. So they established Baitul Hikmah or Darul Hikmah, which is a house of wisdom where people, translators, worked 24-hour, and they were well paid for the translation of the Greek scientific and philosophical material. Although they were not translating mostly directly from the Greek language, but they were translating from the Syriac language where the Greek knowledge and the philosophies were preserved. So this era is known as the golden era for the translation or translating activity, where a lot of sciences, knowledge, philosophies were transferred into the Arabic language from, as I said, the Syriac, indirectly Greek, and the Latin sciences also reflected in the Syriac writings, Sanskrit, Persian. It had become, the Baghdad had become a center of civilization and center of intellectual activity, especially the translation during the Abbasid era. The strategy that we've also have is almost same. Is one is the literal translation strategy in among the Arab translators, and the leader of that strategy is known as Yohanna ibn al-Batriq and Ibn Naim al-Himsi. These are two who promoted the word-for-word translation strategy. They, translating each Greek word with an equivalent under the Greek word equivalent Arabic word. Where they found no Arabic word, they borrowed the Greek word and Arabicized it. What is known in Arabic is ta'rib. Same word is, is given an Arabic form, and of course is borrowed. But this method proved to be unsuccessful as for the understanding of the source text or the content of the source text was concerned. So result was sense for sense approach, and the one who elaborated this approach and promoted this approach is Ibn Ishaq and Al-Jawahiri. And their mission was to create a fluent target text which conveyed the meaning of the original without distorting the target language. Of course, they also kept this factor in mind that the target language, when without distorting the target language. Let me repeat. So they adopted a strategy with which they were trying to create fluent target text which conveyed the meaning of the original without distorting the target language, and that should be fluent for the readers, understandable and readable. And they were very creative, the Arab translators, those who followed this strategy, that they provided instructive and explanatory commentaries and notes with the translation. And let me explain a little about this strategy, the last one, which is the explanatory commentaries and notes, because they actually focused in the first phase to grasp the content of the source text, and then they translated, of course, following the sense for sense strategy. But they also found that there are situations that need explanation, that need more commentary, so they sought help from other sources of the same language or other languages and provided all these commentaries for the readers. This strategy, and the second one is explanation or the commentaries with the translated text. This proved very successful in understanding, amalgamating the this Greek knowledge, and then becoming scientists themselves. So we find that after 100 years, there were, this Islamic Arab civilization, they started producing genuine scientists as well. We have discussed, I think, sufficiently of the word for word and sense for sense or literal versus free translation, and we have taken here three civilizations: Greek, Chinese civilization, and Arabic era, Abbasid era especially. Now we move on to the next topic, which is Bible translation and heresy. This is very interesting topic and very sensitive, I tell you, because the religious text throughout the human history has been very sensitive as for its interpretation and especially its translation into other languages is concerned. So the dominant Roman Catholic Church, they were always favoring, or they were always supporting the correct, quote unquote, and established meaning of the Bible in any language to be translated. So if any translation which is diverging from the accepted interpretation was deemed heretic and banned. So wherever they found that this translation or this attempt or this word or this phrase is actually, is addition into the source text one way or the other, they were very harsh in curbing that tendency, and the translation was bad. So we see the examples here. The history is evident that they burnt uh, many people on charges of heresy, but we are taking here the examples of translation only, and here we are taking the example, for example, William Tyndale, and he was a famous English theologian, an impressive linguist who had mastered 10 languages including Hebrew. You see, his extraordinary English Bible was later used in 17th century as the basis for the King James Version, which is now very much dominant, prevalent, used English version of Bible. So that person was abducted, tried for heresy, and executed in Netherlands in 1536. For of course his mistakes, quote unquote, his mistakes within commas in translating the biblical text. The other one is this French humanist Dolet. He was condemned. He also, of course, I think the example is coming, so no need to jump to the example. So he was condemned by the theological features of the Sorbonne faculty of theology in Sorbonne. Why? Because in his translation of one's Plato's dialogues, he added a few words there, the phrase which meant nothing at all, in a passage which was related to the life hereafter, after death. So this addition, nothing at all, in that passage, and he was not translating Bible, but he was translating a concept related to the biblical text, related to the hereafter. So he added the word nothing at all, and he was accused of that. He has added, and this addition led to the charge of blasphemy. And it was interpreted as the Dolet did not believe in immortality or in life hereafter. Hence, he was burnt in 1546. Okay, when we come to the 16th century, although we have taken two examples of the 16th century, and here we have discussed two great, the intellectuals who was burnt at the hand of the Roman Catholic Church. But we see that the factors of biblical translations, there was a kind of many people actually try to translate Bible into their own languages. So the more major factors were advances in the study of biblical languages and classical scholarship. Number two, general climate of the Reformation. Here I would like to mention the European Renaissance. This was the time when, although the European Renaissance initiated in 14th century in Italy, but now we are in the 16th century, though the fruits of that Renaissance or the efforts for enlightenment started spreading here and there in Europe. Another factor which contributed in the biblical translation 16th century is the advent of the printing press in that century. What was the result? So we have Luther's Bible translation in German language. So non-literal or non-accepted translation was used as a weapon against the church, because in European Renaissance, in the later stages, the sentiment against the church was very high, and people actually were writing against the church in different kinds of genres. So they used this non-literal or non-accepted translation as a weapon against the church. So the translation of New Testament in East Central German language by Luther, the translation of the Old Testament in 1534, he translated the Old Testament in 1522 and the New Testament in 1522 and the Old one in 1534. Luther played a pivotal role in the Reformation. Of course, his ideas were very different because he belonged to the Protestant. He used a regional broad dialect of German language, which actually became the lingua franca afterwards by virtue of this, his translation of Bible into this dialect. As usual, church allegations appeared. They accused Luther of altering the Holy Scriptures in his translations, especially in translation of Paul's words, and these were the words you can see in Latin language, and he translated in the end two lines. You can see he translated with this: we hold that man is justified without the work of the law, only through faith. So he added the word alone or only in his translation, and this word was not present in the original text. So, but there was no equivalent Latin word as for the sola in the source text. So that was the allegation for which he was accused of heresy. So translation means that the individual belief, this was the interpretation of his translation using the word only, that the individual belief is sufficient for a good life. So making the work of the law, which is the religious law, redundant. No need of the religious law in this according to this translation. Luther, of course, defended his translation. He did not take it back. He defended, and in his famous circular letter on translation, which he wrote in 1530, because Luther followed Saint Jerome, he actually quoted Saint Jerome also in his defense, and in his letter, this referred letter here. Of course, he rejected the word for word translation strategy. So Luther counters by saying that he was translating into pure, clear German, where this word only would be used for emphasis. So his belief was that I'm using the word only just because of the emphasis and not to add any meaning, because this is the requirement in the target language or the dialect that I am translating to. So Luther's idea is same as Saint Jerome, but his contribution is crucial in infusion of the Bible with the language of the ordinary people. This is considered a very great contribution on part of Luther. And consideration of translation focusing on the target language and the target reader. So his focus was on the target language and on the target reader, and he has responded to this in a very beautiful way. His famous quote, which extolling the language of the people, he says, "You must ask the mother at home, the children in the street, the ordinary man in the market, thus, and look at their mouths, how they speak, and translate that way." That is, his commitment was with the target language and target text and speakers of the target language. Then they will understand and see that you are speaking to them in German. So that was in nutshell his strategy for translating. His focus was on transferring the message of this religious text Bible to his people in German language using this. So he considered all strata of that society, those who spoke that dialect or that language during his time. With this, we come to this Bible translation heresy. Although I wanted to say a few words about the what has been, evident in the history of the Muslim as for the translation of Quran is concerned, but I think I hold this for the time being, and we come to this topic when we discuss Quran translation, history of Quran translation, because the reactions, harsh reactions, were also found in the history of in the Islamic history on the history of Quran translation. But now we move on to the next topic, which is discussion on the faithfulness, spirit, and truth. These are three very basic and core, we can say, terminologies, but they have been very vague. They have been, not clear. They were not very clear terminologies during, this whole historical era, because they were, explained in a very unconnected way. These both faithfulness or fidelity or spirit and truth, other term, they were expressed in the prefaces of the translators, or practitioners who often ignore what has been written before. So they did not pay any attention to the previous ideas, that were there, of course, expressed by other philosophers, translators, or practitioners about these terms. But the modern scholar Lewis Kelly, he wrote a book and this book was published in 1979. The title of the book is The True Interpreter. So he surveyed the history of this and in inextricably tangled terms, and he says that these are the terms are so tangled, so jumbled up that you cannot separate these terms from, separate them, their ideas or their concepts clearly. These terms are fidelity, faithfulness, spirit, and truth. So, as for the fidelity and faithfulness is concerned, so literal word for word remained dominant until this was the meaning that if you are faithful, if you are really loyal to the original text, so you have fidelity, you have achieved the fidelity, which is means until the end of the 17th. This was the dominant concept of this faithfulness. Fidelity came to be identified with faithfulness in the meaning rather than the words. After the 17th century, this concept of faithfulness or fidelity, it was associated with the meaning uh, rather than the words. That if a translator is faithful to the message, to the content, to the meaning of the text, and is successful in transferring that message, meaning, etc., into the Taru language, he is faithful and he is loyal to the source language. The term spirit had two meanings in the history. We are talking about here in the Western history, of course, including the Greek and the Roman eras, and now, of course, the whole West follows. These are their ideals, the Greeks and the Romans. So it had two meanings. The Latin word, this was the word which is, I don't know the exact pronunciation of this word. It denotes creative energy and inspiration, and mainly it was, of course, related to the literary translation. Saint Augustine used it for Holy Spirit. Now the idea is totally different here. In the writing of this famous Saint Augustine, who used it for the Holy Spirit, who was the messenger, those who brought the message from God. Saint Jerome, that we have discussed earlier, he employed it in both the senses, means creative energy or inspiration and Holy Spirit. So the term was, used in a different meaning in the writings of the writings of the authors and translators, theologians. What was the truth for Saint Jerome? The truth was Hebrew text, to which he returned in his Vulgate translation. Vulgate translation actually is the translation of the Old Testament by Saint Jerome, because he used the original Hebrew for the translation of the Old Testament. So Vulgate means a commonly known common translation of the Old Testament. But it was not until the 12th century that truth was fully equated with content. So now what we mean by the truth, it is now equated with the content. Now we discussed in the context of translation, so we equate the truth with the content. Here are some comments on that. In sacred texts, religious texts, there has been such an interconnection of fidelity to both the words and the perceived sense. Spirit, the energy of the words, and the Holy Spirit, and truth, the content. However, by the 17th century, fidelity had come to be generally regarded as more than just fidelity to words. Spirit lost the religious sense and used in the sense of the creative energy of a text or language. With this, we can now discuss the next topic, which is early attempts for systematic theory. So far, what we have seen here in these slides and what we have discussed so far, we see scattered ideas about word for word, sense for sense, or other terminologies that are used to explain these ideas of the text. So we don't have any systematic attempts to create a translation theory, but here we will see some efforts, and the efforts are, systematic, to create systematic translation theory. So here we will take the ideas, or we'll discuss very briefly the work of Dryden, Dolet, Tytler, and Shyamach. In French, I'm sorry, in German, it is like this: Shaliamach, and in English it is Shaliamak. Shaliamak. So pronunciation, of course, is not very important, but the person is very important as a theorist. And the work of these people is marked an important step towards in translation, systematic translation theory, I must say, because their work depicts deliberate and reasoned statements. We feel that they are really touching some systematic aspects of the translation theory. Translation into English, because we are going to talk about the Dryden first. So translation into English was confined to verse rendering of Greek and Latin classics. So the context, the background in which the Dryden wrote, his ideas, they are emerging from the verse translation of Greek and Latin classics. So let's come to the John Dryden. Brief description of the translation process. Have enormous impact on subsequent translation theory and practice. So he gave us three categories of translation. And in the preface to his translation of Ovid's epistles, that is Ovid's letter, a Roman uh, uh, a writer, or his letters, so he translated these letters into English. So he gave us three categories of translation. Number one, he called metaphrase, which is very much equivalent to word by word and line by line, as we have discussed earlier. The second category, second kind, is paraphrase. By paraphrase, he means authors is kept in view by the translator. So author is always in the mind of the translator. Words are not so strictly followed as his sense is followed. So the priority should be given to the translator according to this approach, which is paraphrase. So the changing whole phrases faithful to sense for sense translation. So you can change whole phrases and remain faithful to sense for sense translation, what he called paraphrase. The third one is in his categorization is imitation, where the translator seek both words and sense, or in other words we can say very free or adaptation, a strategy of very free translation or adaptation, where the manipulation is always there, change is even in the message is always there. What is imitation? It is not that the translator imitates the words or the text of the original writer. Actually, here translator uses the source text, and be attentive to this because this is very important distinction between word for word and imitation. So the translator uses the source text as a pattern to write as he supposes that author would have done had he lived in our age and in our country. So in this imitation, the concept of imitation is that the translator, assumes, takes the writer in a way that the writer is writing, author is writing, and how he would have written this text in the language the translator is translating to, or in this context in which I am or the translator is translating that text to. So it is just like the imitation in course in the target language, of course, so keeping in view the source language, translating into the target language, and living within the ideas of the ideas that are working back in mind in translations, the intellect I mean the author's intellect, and also the whole context, I mean the social context, literary context, time and space both. So I think it is this imitation on the one side is a very huge responsibility and almost unattainable, and on other side, as Dryden has criticized this approach and this strategy, that this should not be adopted. So metaphrase, if he discusses that the metaphrase, which is word for word translation, is just a verbal copy. If a translator is translating word for word, actually he is just producing a copy of the original text without conveying the message successfully. So it is like what? And quote unquote, we see his saying. He said, "Tis much like dancing on ropes with fettered legs." So if your legs are not free, you are trying to dance on the ropes, which is very ridiculous situation. Imitation is also rejected by Dryden, which allows the translator to become more visible, but does the greatest wrong, because translators actually here tries to uh, take more than required responsibility, more than demanded responsibility of becoming the author himself or herself, and then thinking in his shoes and bringing the text of his source language to the target language in the era where the country or the place where the translator is living or translator is experiencing and interacting with that culture. So the preferred approach is paraphrase, as Dryden has explained this one. Now let's move on to the Dolet. We have met him earlier when we were discussing Bible translation heresy. He gave us 5 principles in his treatise, The Way of Translating Well from One Language into Another. So according to him, principle number 1 is the translator must perfectly understand the sense. So the first step is, and material of the original author. Of course, when he is talking about the material, he's talking about the structure, he's talking about the style of the original author, and of course the background also that actually is reflected in his writing, and should feel free to clarify obscurities, should try to understand if things are not clear. So in a simple phrase, we can say the translator must perfectly understand and comprehend the original writing and author. Second principle is the translator should have a perfect knowledge of both source language and target language. I think this is very much obvious. Number 3 is the translator should avoid word for word translation. Number 4, the translator should avoid Latinate and unusual forms. So to show, actually he is advising the translator not to show your knowledge of the Latin language, and in this way you create a kind of barrier between you and the readers. So do not use the Latinate and unusual forms which are not understood easily by the readers. That number 5, the translator should assemble and liaise words eloquently to avoid clumsiness. I mean the construction of the translation or arrangement of the TT target text, words and structure should be very eloquently arranged, avoiding the clumsiness. Where actually of course there are two requirements here, that the structure should be very cohesive, I mean that is read very easily, and also the ideas are coherence, ideas are also expressed clearly. So comments on this Dulles views, we can make a few quick comments. The concern is to reproduce the sense, of course, and to avoid the word translation. We can deduct this from his ideas. The stress is on the eloquent and natural target language form. And I tell you, because this is the area when this was the era when the writers of these European languages, they wanted to promote their own languages. So he was very much concerned, as we have seen the Luther, he was very much concerned with his language, that was the German. Here he is also very much faithful to his language, that is French, not the Latin. They are although they are translating from the Latin, and Latin had at that time a sacred image in the minds of the people. So, but at the same time, Dolet wanted to promote the French language. That's why he says that the stress is on the eloquent and the natural target language form, so that the the language is developed more and fulfills the requirements of other ideas. The stress is on the structure and the independence of the new vernacular French language. As I said, it was considered as a vernacular French language which was spoken by common people at that time, but they wanted to make it a language of knowledge and language of intellect and language of thinking, philosophy, sciences, etc. at that time. Now, after that, we meet another Alexander Fraser Titler, and he wrote an essay on the principles of translation, 1790. And his ideas are briefly in front of us. Source text is completely transfused into target language to be distinctly apprehended, felt by a native of SL as it was felt by native of target language. I mean, as it was felt by the source language native speakers, it should be felt by the target language native speakers. You see, this is very near to what we have seen previously in the approach, what is called Dryden, which Dryden has called imitation. The feeling is transferred. You become the original author and you feel the way he felt, and you also perceive things the way he perceived, and then you try to transfer all that. So he suggests that the translator should write as the original author would have written had he known the target language. So his approach, I think we can see that is that the is very near to what we have seen earlier by Dryden imitation. He also gave us some general laws, rules for translators. He says that a translation should give a complete transcription of the ideas of the original work. Here we can also see that he is actually, you know, this idea is originated in his basic. So, as for the early attempts for systematic translation theory, now we can discuss the Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher is the pronunciation in German, but in English, I think it is Schleiermark. Schleiermacher, Mark, and is a recognized as the founder of modern Protestant theology. And he wrote an essay on the different methods of translating in 1813, and he presented two different he discussed actually that there are two different types of translators with two different types of text. One is the translator who translates commercial text. The second is the one who translates the scholarly and artistic text. In his view, Schleiermacher's views, the second type, the translator or the text type, is the best one, and that should be considered the real translation. And he was of the view that it is almost impossible to translate scholarly and artistic text. I mean, so difficult to translate these them 100%. Of course, when he says almost impossible, of course, in his view, it was 100% transfer of the meaning or the message and the content of the original text. Why? Because the source text meanings are couched, are covered, or embedded in cultural bound language, and in every language almost, where the target language can never fully correspond naturally. It is not, in the control of the translator, regardless of his level, his intellect, or his I mean the his his scholarship and so on and so forth. So he is almost unsuccessful as for the transferring 100% of these text type. So there are word for word and sense for sense approaches, and bringing the source text writer and the target text reader together is the it should be the target of the translator. So he says, after analyzing all that, that there are only two paths left for the true translator. The one path is that the translator leaves the writer in peace and moves the reader toward him. So writer remains at his peace with his text wherever he or she is, and the translator moves the reader towards the writer. This is path number one in Schleiermacher's views. The second is that he leaves the reader in peace as much as possible and moves the writer toward the reader. Of course, he preferred the first approach, where the the reader, you know, is moved towards the writer. So writer remains at peace wherever he is with his text, with his ideas, with his style, structure, etc. So that means alienating as opposed to naturalizing method of translation, where you take the foreign elements, the elements of the source language, structure, terminology, jargon, style, etc., and try to, of course, bring the reader of the target language, uh, to this to these foreign elements that are translated. The translator's strategy actually is to orienting himself or herself by the language and content of the source text, and must valorize the foreign and transfer into the target language. That is very interesting. That was very interesting strategy presented by Shaliamah. But I tell you very frankly that this has also echoed in the modern translation theory as well, especially by Vinotti, and who is of the view, who has talked about the foreignization and domestication, two different theories or strategies for translating. So we are not here to discuss, of course, Vinotti's point of view, but we are here to understand the Shalimach's preferred translation strategy. So with this, of course, I think I have finished, and this is enough. If you need more, you can ask us in the classroom. So with this, we can move to the translation theory in Britain. Here, the main point is, which is should be kept in mind, that the focus was on the status of the source text and the form of the target language, because the source text, it was sacred. It was considered sacred text in Britain or in other European countries. That was written because it was written in Latin and based on the Greek ideas also. They were also, part of the writings of those sacred texts. So here we see a debate between Francis Newman and Matthew Arnold over the translation of Homer. Newman emphasized the foreignness of, like we saw just Schleiermacher's point of view, foreignness of the work by a deliberately archaic translation, and yet saw himself as reaching out to a wide audience. Means the Newman's view was that Homer should be translated in a way where Homer should look Homer, and the reader, should be brought together in the words of Schleiermacher, of course. But his idea was that the translator should use the archaic language deliberately, and at the same time, he sees that this strategy is very successful as for reaching out to a wide readership. On the other hand, Matthew Arnold opposed this approach in his lecture on the topic of untranslating Homer, which he delivered in 1861, and he advocated a transparent translation method and advises the audience to put their faith in scholars who are qualified to compare the effect of target text to source text. I mean, that the transparent translation method should be adopted, where the the reader should trust the scholars who are well qualified and to compare the effect of the target text to source text. With this, we come to the last point and the last slide as well. Here, we have we have to discuss 3 points maybe. You see this these Saint Jerome, Luther, Dryden, and Shalimach, and Tytler, Dolet, Duan, Ibn Ishaq. We have seen these belonging to three different civilizations. These scholars and theologians and philosophers and translators, they have left really immense influence on the translation theory in their own, of course, nations, in their own literature. So these names should be, to conclude, should be kept in mind that these have been influential as for the development of the translation theory before 20th century. This era, as I said in the earlier, and I conclude with this point as well, this era is known as non-linguistic translation theory. And of course, the span of time is almost more than 2000 years. When we say non-linguistic translation theory, actually we are we when we say linguistic translation theory, we are talking about the analysis of the lexical items, the structure, the sentence structure, the grammar, the style, and of course the semantic, the meanings, the of the connotative meaning, denotative meanings, and also the other types of associative meanings, etc. So here we are, these theorists, they did not discuss, or they did not, of course, analyze the linguistic properties of the source or the target languages. So that's why they can be called era of non-linguistic translation theory. In the subsequent eras, we see that in the beginning, the next phase was the emergence of linguistic theories of translation, which that we shall inshallah discuss. And after that, we see the functional and the theories related to the discourse analysis, and then the cultural turn, and then hermeneutics theories related to the translation, and so on and so forth. So the point here is, which I want to emphasize at the end of this lecture, which is very, very important, that so far we have seen the pre 20th century developments in translation theory, but after that we would be touching, according to our need, of course, not in detail, the theories that emerged out of or under the influence of the currents that were prevalent, like the linguistics, and then so on and so forth. In the end, the cultural and ideological turn, and then in nowadays we are talking about the hermeneutics, and I don't want to confuse you with the big terminology at this time. So inshallah, Lazi, take very good care of yourself. Assalamu alaikum.